My name is David Donoghue. I'm the head of engineering in Zalando's development center in Dublin. And today I'm going to talk to you about autonomous teams and how we use them within Zalando. So I'm not going to talk really today specifically about microservices, but it's probably important for you to understand that really microservices have enabled the significant organizational transformation that I'm going to talk about now. So I'm aware there's probably some people in the room don't actually know who Zalando are. So just let me take a brief moment just to give you some history. The company was founded in Berlin 2008, and pretty much since day one, the company's experienced phenomenal success and phenomenal growth. So here are some of the key numbers. Today we sell into 15 countries across the continent. We have over 12,000 people within the organization, but within the tech organization in Zalando there are 1,700 people. And probably the most significant number there is our revenue for 2016, which was 3.6 billion. So by any standard, Zalando is a really, really big organization, and I think that's relevant to the story. We're not talking about a startup, we're not talking about a 50-person organization. This is a big organization. Okay, so before we talk about what autonomy is and what an autonomous team is, let's just very briefly talk about why autonomy. Although I mentioned Zalando has been a very, very successful company throughout its history, we did experience some issues back towards the end of 2014. That meaning we had a significant number of really talented people decide that they didn't want to work in the organization anymore. And this was really significant, especially for the founders of the company, because some of these individuals were some of the men and women that had been involved pretty much from day one. So the organization spoke to a lot of these people, and pretty much they heard the same thing back from everybody. Zalando had been the best organization these people had ever worked in. It was an incredibly exciting place to work. The people had a real sense of ownership of the organization, but now that the organization had kind of grown and gotten bigger, it looked kind of like this. So I think you probably all recognize what this represents. It's pretty much a traditional, top-down hierarchy. It represents pretty much a command and control organization where the guys at the top make all the decisions. They normally kind of implement processes and practices and rules where all the people at the bottom need to follow and adhere to, so that we can bring a bit of control and structure to the organization. So the founders were kind of shocked when they realized that this is what they had become. It wasn't intentional. It's kind of what happens as a company grows. And there's a real fear that you lose control and you end up putting these structures in place to try and keep control of the organization. It's a natural reaction to the growth. But the founders were very clear on something. Although maybe this had happened, this was definitely not the organization that we wanted to be. The guys have a very strong sense of, I guess, entrepreneurial spirit, and they really wanted to look at creating an environment where people would have a sense of ownership, would be engaged in the organization, and would have that sense of entrepreneurship, even though it was a large organization. And that's when the company started to look at doing autonomy and building autonomous teams and trying to do it at scale. Now the thing is, when you talk about doing autonomy or an autonomous team in the workplace, there's a lot of people very, very skeptical about that concept. Whether we like it or not, certainly people of my generation and Joe's generation, we've probably grown up in organizations like this. Maybe this is all we know, and it's really, really embedded very, very deeply in people, to the extent that there are a lot of skeptics out there around the concept of an autonomous team in the organization. And even to this day, I still have a lot of people that would approach me And I get these comments all the time. Yeah, that might work in a startup, but there's no way you could do that in a large organization. Or autonomy in the workplace, especially something as big as Zalando. That sounds like complete chaos. And then, of course, the classic flat organization will never work. You absolutely need leaders. So people really, really struggle with this idea of autonomy and just can't visualize it, just can't see how it could possibly work. What's interesting, though, and the good news around this, is that there's over 40 years worth of science, 40 years worth of research, and quite literally hundreds of papers that say not only should this work, but in actual fact, for companies like the ones that we work in, that there is autonomy is exactly the thing that we should be looking at to get the best out of our people. So I referenced some of the science that sits behind that statement, and the key bit of science here is something that's called self-determination theory. And self-determination theory is about human motivation, basically. And it states that there are three types of motivation that can exist within people. There's amotivation, which means a total lack of intention to act. This is where an individual has absolutely no motivation whatsoever. I'm prepared to put my hand up. Plenty of times I've felt that way about many things in my life. I'm sure you've all experienced it as well. There's controlled motivation. This is when you have a sense of having to do something in order to get a reward, such as a pay packet, maybe, or maybe having to do something to avoid punishment. If I don't do this, if I don't get it done, I'm going to get in trouble. The boss is going to give out. I might even get fired, whatever it is. But you have a sense of having to do something really being generated by an external pressure. And then there's autonomous motivation. And this is when you have a sense of wanting to do something because you find it interesting, you find it fun, or maybe the outcome of doing the task is something that's completely aligned with your own personal values. So you develop a motivation to actually want to do it, and that's a more an internal driven thing. So what's interesting here is what all this research and what the science says about these different forms of motivation. So if you look at controlled motivation, it says that it's as good or maybe even a little better than autonomous motivation at doing simple or mundane tasks. Every time I read that statement, I think of my father. My father worked in a factory. He worked on a production line all his life. He showed up early and clocked in early in the morning, clocked out, late in the evening. And, he would have had a supervisor standing over him, watching what he was doing, watching how he was doing what he was doing, and, making sure that he was adhering to the whatever rules and process they had on the particular production line. I personally don't know how we done that. I could certainly never work that way. But, that concept of supervision, it works fine in this kind of scenario. You know what? It worked for my dad as well, because from his perspective, all work meant to him was putting food on the table for his family. So, he had to work in order to get a paycheck to feed his family. Work was simply a transaction to him. I'm kind of guessing, like me, all of you guys probably feel different about your work and what you're trying to get out of your work. And it's probably something closer to the description we have here for autonomous motivation, which again has been shown by all this science and all this research. And that is, autonomous motivation is far superior than controlled motivation for tasks that are complex, that require problem solving, creativity, innovation, or a task that requires persistence. So quite literally what the science is telling us, for people like you and me, because I know when I get up every day, I face complexity. I'm required to be creative, I'm required to be innovative, and I'm pretty sure you guys are exactly the same. So the science is actually telling us, for organizations like ours, we need to look at environments and creating cultures within our organizations that maximize the amount of autonomous motivation that the people within those organizations experience in order to be effective at doing the kind of work that we do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Zalando. If that's the science behind this, how do we approach this problem? So we do something at Zalando that we call radical agility. It's a name we put on it, and basically its focus is in trying to generate or maximize the amount of autonomous motivation that people in Zalando experience when they come into work. So with radical agility, the very core unit within the organization is this concept of an autonomous team. Typically, there'll be 4 to 8 people within a team, and they will have autonomy over a range of things. Now, it will differ maybe from team to team based on the maturity of that team, but basically, teams get choice around technologies that they use. They get choice around architectural issues. They experience choice around planning. So, who's going to do what and when are we going to do it by? So they will have freedom to make those kind of decisions. And as I said, it'll differ from team to team. Some more mature teams may have even additional scope on top of that. With each one of these autonomous teams, though, we focus on 3 key principles. And they are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy, as I've been saying, is trying to do things to ensure that these individuals and this team experiences the maximum sense, maximizing the sense of choice that these people experience in doing their work. Mastery is about focusing on the individuals in the team and their competence. So what does that mean? It quite literally means, do these individuals have the competence to do the things we're asking them to do? And if they don't, we need to help them develop those competencies. That's our responsibility as well as the individuals to help them get there. I always think this is a very powerful statement, pretty simple, but it's powerful. Motivation cannot exist without competence. So think about that for a second. Motivation cannot exist without competence. So if I don't have the competence to do something, I'm just not going to fit. If I don't believe I can develop the competence to do a task, I will not generate any motivation to do that task. Finally, purpose. I always used to fall into the trap of, you see it on telly, someone talking about, they work at curing cancer or something really, really noble like that. And I always think, wow, imagine having that as your purpose. I mean, it must be incredibly motivating, something like that. But what the science actually says is, from the perspective of what we do on self-determination theory, purpose doesn't have to be as noble as that. It's simply providing people with a meaningful rationale for why our work is important. Okay, so here's maybe the surprising bit when we talk about an autonomous team. So we create these teams, we focus on these principles, but we don't just abandon the team, we don't just give them a task and wish them good luck and let us know when you're done. It's probably not going to work if that's the approach that you take. We surround these teams with leaders. Not just one leader, but in our case, 3 leaders. We have an individual that we call a delivery lead. So this delivery lead is normally a senior, competent, technical individual. And he or she will work with the team, will coach, will mentor, and will guide that team towards delivery. The practice lead will focus on competence. So the practice lead won't work with the team, but the practice lead will work with the individuals within the team and work with them on building their competence, as I said, to do the job. And then we have a product owner, which is probably a concept that most of you guys have in your organizations as well. So this is the individual that will bring the requirements, that will bring the user stories and help the team to understand, most likely from the perspective of the customer or maybe the business, why this work that we're doing is important. Okay, so we've been doing this for 2 years now, I guess we've learned a few things along the way. So I think there are a couple of key takeaways from this slide. The first being, autonomy does not equal independence. If I go back to the skeptics, you know, as I said, Zalando's a large organization. We have, I think, at this stage, probably around 180 autonomous teams. That's 180. So that's a lot of autonomous teams. So if these teams were independent, yeah, I mean, the skeptic is probably right. This is going to be complete chaos. You're going to have 180 teams going in different directions. Zalando will be out of business probably within a year. That just wouldn't work. So autonomy does not mean independence. So I'll bring you back to the statement on the right. It means experiencing a sense of choice. And there's a really, really big difference between those two things. Competence is necessary. So I've given the example, but let me just call it out again. If you don't have the competence to do a task, and I give you the autonomy to complete that task, make no mistake about it, that task is going to end in failure, right? It makes no sense. You don't have the competence to do the job. I have no right giving you autonomy over that task. It's just not going to work. And in actual fact, as leaders within the organization, then, you are responsible really for making that assessment. Looking at an individual or looking at a team, do they have the competence to actually do what we're asking them to do? If they don't, it is kind of okay then to be a mentor, to be a little bit more directive with that team and help them then develop the skills that they need. But the point is, once they do develop that competence, you know, picture teaching a kid how to ride a bike, you know, just that moment when you do let go and the kid wobbles, but then, you know, they do take off down the street, you with a tear in your eye. So it's kind of the same thing. Competence is necessary for autonomy. Then finally, again, I've said it, but leadership is critical. And this is one of these things, this is not just based on our experiences in Zalando. The science is actually saying this, the research is actually saying this. An autonomous team, for it to succeed, you need external leadership around that team. They play a critical role. I used the term earlier, the flat structure. I mean, this is wrong. I probably shouldn't have used the term. It's something I hear people talk about a lot. You know, if you think of the traditional hierarchy, the pyramid, and people talk about this day and age maybe giving people more freedom around decisions and how they do the job. Let's remove layers of management. Let's remove layers of leadership. This is actually wrong. The flat organization, again, I think one of the skeptics said it, they're probably right. If you had a flat organization without leadership, this probably wouldn't work. So leadership is absolutely critical for this to work. That's the good news if you're a leader. Autonomy doesn't mean you're going to lose your job. The bad news is you need to learn a whole new way of doing your job. The style, the leadership style that you employ is completely different in both models. So if we just zoom out a little bit then, and rather than just look at the team, you know, if you imagine this is the whole organization, I always think when I look at this picture, it kind of displays something about our leaders, that they're actually the glue in the system, keeping everything glued together. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. But the key takeaway from this picture is that collaboration matters. So again, we've got about 180 autonomous teams. In some scenarios, you know, a team might be working on something pretty small, to the extent that they're not independent. They're independent. They don't have any dependencies on other development teams. They're still dependent on their leaders, but they don't have dependencies on other development teams. That's quite a simple model. These people are only dependent on themselves to complete and achieve the task that they've been given. In other scenarios, of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. We have big projects, we have big features that are spanning kind of multiple business units, and this is really complex. So I guess the point here is collaboration matters. Why? Because you still have the traditional issues and difficulties and problems with not only collaboration, but with coordination amongst the teams. Those things don't just disappear because you're in an autonomous team. So I guess the one advice I would give here, we've seen this issue, sometimes as developers, I know I can be like this, or maybe I used to be like this. You're a little bit introverted, and there's nothing better than sticking on your headphones and just hacking away at some code for a whole day. That's just sheer joy. The problem is if that's what you've got in a team full of people, this is going to suffer. Collaboration and coordination really suffers. So this is a really big takeaway. I think it's something we've had to look at from a hiring perspective to make sure that we build those values by putting individuals with those attributes into these teams. Okay, and maybe this is just the one reference then to microservices. This point is really obvious. I think 2 years ago, so everyone's using the same words today, but yes, we had a monolith, and the simple truth is we could not go with this organizational model if we were to stick with the monolith. Why? Because when it comes to building, when it comes to testing, when it comes to deploying, there are just hard dependencies between people and between teams. So you could be autonomous in name, but the reality of that would be something completely different. So from this perspective, architecture must support autonomy. And in terms of what we've done in Zalando, we've been able to use, by moving towards microservices, this has enabled the approach that we're taking. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the science behind this, just giving you a little insight into, I guess, how we organize ourselves and how we structure ourselves in Zalando to try and do this. So, I think the key question is then, right, does it work? We've been doing it for 2 years now. What kind of evidence do we have to suggest that maybe this is something that you guys should look at? I'm not necessarily suggesting that in the first place, but I am happy to share some data points, I guess. So if we look at a really high-level view, a big picture, if you like. So on the left-hand side, this is Zalando's revenue since 2008. What's really key here is that we've been doing this for 2 years now. So just before we started, we had revenues of 2.2 billion. And as I said earlier, we now have revenues in 2016 of 3.6 billion. So I'm not saying this happened because we do autonomous teams. I'm not saying that at all. Again, I guess I'm thinking about the skeptics that warned that it'll never work. It'll be complete chaos, doom and gloom. I'm offering this as evidence that not only did we not break, not only did something bad not happen, but in actual fact, the company is totally thriving. The second data point is in 2015, we had 800 people in the tech organization in Zalando. Today, as I said earlier, we've got 1,700 people, so we've more than doubled. I'm absolutely convinced that why have we been able to attract these people to the organization? Yeah, it absolutely helps if you're a successful organization, there's no question. But I am going to say, people want to work this way. I take this as a huge endorsement, it's a huge statement by people in the industry saying, yes, they see it, they recognize it because they're in organizations where they don't experience some of the things that I've just been talking about, but they know that they're being asked to solve problems, they're being asked to be creative, yet they have some manager who's micromanaging or telling them how to do their job and so on. I suspect as developers, we all have this very strong in us. And so I take this as a huge statement around what we've done, that people absolutely want to work this way. Okay, so if that's really at a very high level, what do we have that's maybe a little bit more detailed in terms of trying to answer the question that does this work? So earlier this year, we've done some research within the organization, and we wanted to look at a few things. So obviously, we wanted to look at autonomous motivation, and we were asking some questions around, like, how do you generate that? can we verify through some of the things that we're doing that we are actually generating autonomous motivation in our people? And if we are, what impact is that actually having on the business? While we were doing that, it made sense to kind of take a look at controlled motivation and amotivation as well. So the first thing we were really interested in looking at, as I said, I've called it out already, leadership is really critical. So not just any leadership though. So the measure we used here is something called empowering leadership. And specifically that was looking at, leaders who lead by example, leaders who provide choice to their people, coaching, providing information, understanding the staff's perspective, and encouraging self-initiation. So we looked at this, and probably as we would have predicted, what we found is that empowering leadership had a significant positive relationship with autonomous motivation. So what that means is the more empowering leadership you experience, the more autonomous motivation you get. So our data completely supporting that. Empowering leadership also had a significant negative relationship with amotivation. And what that means is that the more empowering leadership you have, the less amotivation you have in that relationship. So that was interesting, but that probably what we expected to see, but we were still kind of happy to see it, to be honest. Next thing we looked at then was individual performance. And the measure for individual performance that we used looked at what's called a core activity proficiency. And what that means is, imagine the job spec for your role, all the things it says on that. If you can do that proficiently, that's core proficiency. But again, as you guys know as well as me, in the industry that we work in, we face a lot of uncertainty, we face a lot of change. So this particular measure for performance also looked at adaptability and proactivity, which are really critical attributes in this day and age, I believe, in our industry at least. So in this case, we found that autonomous motivation had a significant positive relationship with individual performance. There was no sign of anything between individual performance and controlled motivation, and no sign of anything between amotivation and individual performance. Next, we looked at effective commitment. So the organizational science says that there's 3 different types of commitment an individual can have with an organization. The first is continuance commitment. This is where I don't really want to work here anymore. I want to go, but these guys pay me too well. I can't get the same salary somewhere else, or I'm not having any luck finding another job, so I just have to stay here for a while until I find something else. This is kind of catastrophic, obviously, for the organization, and it's not really a great situation for an individual to be in either. There's normative commitment where, I get paid a fair wage. It's not a bad company. I like some of the guys that I work with. I'm happy enough here, but I'm probably not going to give the company much more than the kind of the 9-to-5 effort that they get from me right now. Effective commitment is, I guess, the most significant form of commitment. This is, where I formed a real emotional bond with the company. I really, really identify with the company. And once individuals start doing that, that's where discretionary effort starts to emerge. That's when we feel that, we start going above and beyond. And you know what? We actually enjoy doing it because we care about the organization. So when we looked at this, probably predictably again, we found that there was a significant positive relationship between autonomous motivation and effective commitment. We also found that there was a significant negative relationship between amotivation and effective commitment. So, very much in line with, I guess, the 40 years of science and self-determination theory. We're not finding anything surprising, but it's really fantastic from our own perspective to confirm that this is actually what's happening within the organization. The last one, however, is a little bit interesting. So I guess one of the issues we had when we started rolling out autonomous teams, there's a lot of leaders in the organization, and as I said, I think command and control is very deeply embedded in a lot of us, and we've grown up with it. We don't know any better, and some of our leaders, I guess, had difficulty with the move to autonomous teams because they understood that they shouldn't undermine the autonomy of a team by being overly directive. But now they started to have a sense of difficulty in terms of doing their job. They used to long for the old days, that I could get a team together, I could tell them to do something, and I could hold them accountable. I could make them responsible. I'm going to drag these guys into my office next Friday, and I want an update, because this is really important, and I'm going to hold you accountable, and I need you to know that I'm holding you accountable. I guess the guys realized that, well, we probably can't behave that way anymore. And so if you even think about that word, I'm going to hold you accountable, it's very controlling, even in the words that we use. It's a very kind of controlling style of management. But we were interested in looking at this because I guess there's something within self-determination theory as well that had kind of hinted that with items like this, if you're in an organization where you're experiencing significant amounts of autonomous motivation, your perception of some of these things can change. And surprise, surprise, what we found was not only did accountability have a significant positive relationship with controlled motivation, which I think is probably predictable, but we also found that accountability, well, not only did it have a significant positive relationship with a motivation, but the strength of this relationship was significantly more than that between accountability and controlled motivation. It was stronger. So, if you look at the picture, that's pretty significant. So this means for our command and control leaders that they can still achieve a lot of the things that you wanted to achieve with command and control, but your approach and your style needs to be different. So in other words, if you have empowering leadership and you're generating autonomous motivation, you can actually make that autonomous motivation even stronger with something like accountability. But it's just how you're doing it. It's the style that you're applying the accountability is really, really important here. Okay, I should say with any research, this represents data from Zalando. It's kind of dangerous to make big generalizations that all of this is probably universally true and you'll experience the same thing in your organization. It's a bit of research that generates some data. It's a snapshot, it's a point in time, but it does reflect, and our data does support that within Zalando, this is what we're seeing. This is the effect and the impact that the approach we're taking is having on our people. Okay, so just one final thought. So there's another interesting thing about autonomous motivation. And again, all the science, all the research backs this up. Not only does it have this positive impact on people's performance and their effective commitment, there's significant data there that shows that when people experience autonomous motivation, they don't experience stress, they don't experience burnout, and they experience significantly higher amounts of psychological well-being. So for me, this is kind of phenomenal because if you put all this together, and personally, I think this is it's a profound statement. What that actually means is the very things that are good for an organization are the same things that are good for its people. Okay, thanks very much for your time. Thank you.